We're told that Job is a faithful man who feared God and turned away from evil. And yet we discover that Job has become the subject of testing. Job's story is set on two planes. We've got the earthly plane and the spiritual plane. It's a story of great drama, of riches to rags and back again, and the resilience of faith. On the earthly plane, we have Job, who's a prosperous farmer. He's thousands of livestock, a large family, and many servants. And in the spiritual plane, we have this heavenly court between God and the accuser. A claim is brought before God that Job is only faithful to God because he is wealthy, and everything was going well for him. God challenged the accuser for evidence, and so a trial begins and Job is tested. We enter the story as Job hits rock bottom. All he has been destroyed. His livestock, his servants, even his children are taken away from him in death. When he failed to provide evidence of Job's lack of faith, the accuser he's cursed with great pain and physical suffering and illness. So everything's taken away from Job, and then Job himself is attacked. But this still failed to yield the required results. And we come to Job as he sits in the tatters and the ashes of his former life. Our second reading is from the Gospel of Luke. It's possibly a more familiar passage, as it's one that's often told around Easter time, and it's known as one of the resurrection narratives. It's the journey of the road to Emmaus. Jesus makes himself known to his followers in the days following the weeks following his death and resurrection. Two of his disciples on their way home after witnessing Jesus's death and crucifixion. And a stranger, overhearing their conversation, stops and asks what has happened. And so let's listen to our two passages this morning, our passages of encounter. Thank you, Doreen, for reading from the book of Job, and then Adrian from the Gospel of Luke.
Job's friends come. Three of Job's friends were Eliphaz from the city of Teman, Bildad from the land of Shua, and Zophar from the land of Nehemiah. When they heard how much Job had been suffering, they decided to go and comfort him. While they were still a long way off, they saw Job, but did not recognize him. When they did, they began to weep and wail, tearing their clothes in grief and throwing dust into the air and on their heads. Then they sat there on the ground with him for 7 days and nights without saying a word, because they saw how much he was suffering.
The walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask a question. Who has been an important part of your faith story? Or to ask a different way, who's been an important part of your faith journey so far? Is there a name that comes to mind? Someone who has impacted on you being a Christian? Someone who's helped you come to know something of God? What was it about them? Did they do something? Was it something that they said? Or was it their presence? Did someone come alongside you during a challenging and difficult time that has had an impact on you? It might be hard to recall the name of that person now, or what it was specifically about them. But don't worry, it might be something that you want to think about the next time you pause to pray, to bring to mind that person, to remember what it was about them, and to give thanks to God for them. For me, there's been a number of people over the last year, or over the last few years, many years, who have had an impact on my faith journey. There were Sunday school teachers who encouraged us to explore the different stories in the Bible. There was ministers and elders who encouraged me to start leading worship. But maybe more importantly than these was one person who didn't know me very well. We'd said hi a few times, coming and going from church. But they saw me. They noticed me and noticed when life was particularly challenging, and came and sat with me. They listened to my story. They listened to what was happening at that particular moment. They held silence when I didn't want to talk, and shared something of their own story, offered an alternative narrative, offered something of God's story, and suggested where God might be present in my current story. That conversation was probably only half an hour, 45 minutes at the very most. But in that moment, they were present with me in the place where I was. Over the past 2 years, I've been serving as university chaplain and exploring what young adults think about faith and the church, and how the church or a local congregation might be able to reach out to them. In a nutshell, young adults are looking for places where they can belong, places where they can have an impact and connect with other people. They're looking for safe places where they can explore ideas about themselves and about the world, where they can push boundaries and express doubts. They don't want to be told answers or to fit into a precast mold, but to forge their own way in the world, to find their own path and to make a difference. They believe they have something to offer, something to give, but it might not be what we expect or what we wish for. We just need to look and to reflect on how our young people have responded to the call of climate action with school strikes, which included universities, the more recent Black Lives Matter protests. Young people will not be silent when they believe in a cause and seek for real change to happen. But they don't believe the church is a place for any of this to happen. They don't see the church as a safe place to express doubt or to ask questions. They don't believe that they or their friends will be accepted in the church for who they are. And they don't recognise a church as a place to belong to explore their identity. Churches are old-fashioned, they're out of touch with the real world. They're places where people are criticised, told what to do, how to behave, and what to think. They don't see what difference being a Christian makes. They're not seeing the transformative presence of God within the lives of the church or the lives of its members. And that's the problem. Or that's the challenge. Because I think a lot of churches are wanting these sorts of people. And I believe a lot of churches are the sorts of places that our young adults are looking for, that people can come to explore. I believe churches are wanting the enthusiasm and life. They're wanting to be places where anybody can grow and learn and come to know something of the love of God for themselves. And me, more importantly, I believe that God is wanting these sorts of people to be builders and stewards of God's kingdom. I don't want us to get too caught up on the doom and gloom of this, or to argue about whether or not we feel as churches or as congregation members we are welcoming and accepting. Instead, I want to offer a model, a biblical model of what it might look like for a church, and more importantly, what it might look like for us as individual Christians to engage with young adults, or actually what it might look like for us to engage with anybody. Because we're all looking for somewhere to belong, somewhere to experience something of love, mercy, and grace. And the unique thing about a church is that this is the only place where those things can be found together. No other community group can offer those same things. Our readings this morning offer a model of being intentionally present with another person. They offer an image of what it might look like to come alongside someone else, not to fulfill our own needs, but to accompany another person in their journey. Job had lost everything. He's scraping the bottom of the barrel low. He's lost his home, his wealth, his health. He goes into a state of mourning and grieving for the life that he once had. 3 friends come and sit with him. Simple as that. At this part in the story, the friends are present with Job where he is in his grief. They don't try and lift him out of his sorrow, they join him in it. Their comfort comes from their presence, and they're waiting until Job is ready to speak first. As the story progresses, they try and suggest ways in which Job could pull himself out of his stupor, offering another narrative, ways in which God might be active in his life. But for Job, these were not the answers. And yet his friends stayed and listened. They didn't just try once and then leave, but they stayed and continued to listen. In the same way, Jesus, the stranger to the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, was present. He joined the disciples where they were and listened to their story. It was only after listening to their story that he offered a different perspective. He retold their story in light of the gospel story, showing where God had been active, what that story had revealed about God in their lives. It was only after he journeyed with them, got to know them, understood their story and what was important to them, that he offered an alternative narrative and helped them to see glory in their own story. Jesus didn't invite the disciples to come to church with him or promise that he would have all the answers. Neither did Job's friends. In the first instance, they were present. They listened and they asked questions. They took time to hear story and then offered something of their own story and of how God had been alive for them. This is something that I've learned to do in my work with the chaplaincy. It's become part of my approach with talking to student and staff. I've needed to learn what it means to be intentionally present, to pause, to watch, to look, to listen, rather than to have my own agenda, to go in there with the desire to connect and want to have these meaningful conversations. I've needed to pull back and to just wait. But to create time and space where folk feel comfortable and able to share something of their story. I invite them to tell me what's going on in their lives, just like the stranger asked the 2 disciples what was happening in their lives. And then listen. And then if it felt right, and only after listening and in response to what I heard, would I share something of my story, and then something of God's story, or something of how God had been a source of strength for me. Or I'll share a Bible story which had something in common with their story. I'd offer another narrative. No, I didn't always get it wrong, and I still don't always get it right, even rather than wrong. I don't always get it right. Sometimes the story that I share doesn't find a connection. Sometimes I don't feel it's right to share something of God's story in that moment. And sometimes I regret not doing so. But each time the intention is to be present in that moment for that person, and to recognize God in that encounter. The joy about this approach is actually you can't get it wrong. There's no manual, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. And often we try and hide behind the fear of not knowing the answer, but in this case, there is no wrong answers, because we're sharing something of our story and something of who God is to us. That's very personal. And that will be different for each one of us, because it's our story. It's as unique to us as somebody else's story is unique to them. But it's also a challenge. It means that we have to be vulnerable. We have to open ourselves up to questions, to comments. And it can feel unnatural to begin with. But this, I believe, is part and parcel of what being a disciple is, of the call that each one of us has in sharing the good news. It's about sharing stories of what God has done in our lives and inviting others to do the same. A good place to start is with friends and family, to be purposeful, intentional, to take time to come alongside someone else, to ask how they are, to listen to what has been happening in the last week for them, to ask if there are any challenges, even ask if they felt close to God this past week and what it was that they were doing. And then to share something of your own story. You might feel able to pick up the phone this coming week and ring somebody. Start with somebody that you trust. Maybe start with a friend from church so you can share together in this uncomfortable space, because it might very well be an uncomfortable space to begin with, but start with somebody that you trust. Before doing so, pause and pray. Ask God to help you as you dial the number, to be open to God's prompting in that conversation. Our starting point must always be to meet people where they are and to listen to their story. This is modeled time and again in Jesus' story, in our gospel narratives, and even in our epistles. And it's the only way that we can begin to break down those barriers which divide us. It's the only way we can begin to break down those assumptions that say that church is outdated, that church no longer has a voice. Our stories say what the relevance of church is, because our stories mean something to us as much as church means something to us. Let's pray. Loving God, you came and lived in the world around us. You came and walked beside all people, offering something of love and mercy, showing each person you met that they were worthy of your time. We give thanks for all people who have been a part of our journey so far, those who have encouraged us, those who have listened to us, and those who sit with us, showing something of your love and mercy in their very presence. You call each one of us to be your disciples, to be your hands and feet in this place. May we be open to encounters with others and have the courage to share our own story with those that we meet, led by your Spirit. Amen.